Good morning, everyone. Morning. So we're working our way through a very unusual, unwelcome, and some would say unpleasant part of the Bible called the Book of Lamentations. The reason for the unpleasantness, of course, is because Lamentations tries to give voice to loss. It tries to articulate the human groan, the sigh that escapes from the soul after something unspeakable happens. And as I think you all know, the difficult thing about losing isn't losing. It's what happens after you've lost. When your loved one died, it was awful, really awful, but at least there were things to do. There were people to call, forms to fill in, a funeral to arrange, visits from family, cards from friends. But when all of that faded away, then the long sentence of your loss really began. That's when it started. The chair, always empty. The phone ringing, never them. The car pulling into the driveway, never theirs. And that slow, I think, torturous sentence of grief that comes in waves. Like you think you're okay and then it hits you again, and then you think you're okay and it hits you again and again and again. That is the subject of Lamentations chapter 4. The writer says, "How the gold has lost its luster, the fine gold become dull." Now there's something very subtle going on here that I'll try to explain to you. Have a look at this. So this is the Hebrew alphabet, which has 22 letters, beginning with Aleph, then Beit, then Gimel, then Dalet, then Vav, all the way up to the final letter Tav. Now you know as much about it as I do. I'm just kidding, you don't. Anyway, so anyway, there's 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. Now what's interesting is that in Lamentations chapter 1, there were 22 verses. Verse 1 began with Aleph, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Verse 2 began with Beit, the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Verse 3 began with Gimel, the third letter of the Hebrew alphabet, all the way up to verse 22, which began with Vav, the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. That was chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Lamentations. There are again 22 verses. Verse 1 begins with Aleph, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Verse 2 begins with Beit, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. I see a pattern emerging. All the way up to verse 22, which began with Tav, the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Then, in chapter 3, there were 66 verses. The pattern trebles. Verses 1, 2, and 3 begin with Aleph, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Verses 4, 5, and 6 begin with Beit, the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and so on. The reason the writer trebles the pattern in chapter 3 is because he wants to give his readers a clue that in this chapter, in the middle of his pain, he's trebling the intensity. So what's happening in that chapter is that he hears the bad news, he's reacted to the bad news, and then his emotions begin to spike all over the place. Things start to get very unstable and crazy in his head, and you remember what that was like. The 1, 2, 3 days after you went through that trauma, you were a mess, remember? And how, in fairness, could you be anything else? You just lost a loved one, a marriage, a relationship, a career. Could you sleep? Not a chance. Were you interested in food? Not at all. Could you concentrate? Not remotely. Your head was everywhere. So that was chapter 3. Everything's intense. And then in chapter 4 that we're looking at today, after the emotions have spiked all over the place, we go back to our pattern of 22 verses, each beginning with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet. This is an ancient linguistic clue. That things are kind of empty now. The writer is saying, all the tears have been cried. All the anger's been let out. All I'm left with now is the empty resignation of loss. So Lamentations chapter 4 is the morning after the funeral. It's the day after the divorce papers have been signed. It's after the house has been cleared and the pink slip put in your pocket. It's just you and the rest of your life, all cried out. And speaking in that place, he says, poetically, how the gold has lost its luster. Now, what's disorienting about this opening line is that when he talks about the luster of gold, he's of course talking about all of the things that we value in life. Everything that you were working so hard to get, everything that you are so cautiously attempting to maintain, everything that you find so pleasurable at the moment. And he looks back on all of the things that he once held so dear, and now he feels nothing at all. Nothing does it for him anymore. And I would suggest that this is an unwelcome sentiment because it devalues absolutely everything. Take this old Volkswagen Beetle, for example. Whenever I see an old car like that lying in a field, I can't help but think that not too long ago, within our lifetime in fact, this was somebody's pride and joy. I mean, not too long ago, somebody worked hard and saved up real money to buy this car. And when they drove it out of the parking lot, all shiny and new, it felt good. And the new car smell was the smell of success. And on a Saturday morning, they would polish it faithfully and then take their family out for a drive. And it was the 70s. Their wife would be there wearing one of those short flowery dresses. And it was just fantastic. And now it's just junk. The poet is saying that eventually time makes losers of us all. And he wants us all to know that the things that matter so much to us today, tomorrow won't matter at all. Trauma changes you. How the gold has lost its luster. How I feel nothing. How I taste nothing. It's just nothing. Then in verse 5, the disorientation continues. He says, those who eat delicacies are destitute in the streets. Those brought up in purple now lie on ash heaps. So when he talks about people who ate delicacies and were brought up wearing royal purple, he's saying, these are the people who used to exist at the very top of our economic system. And they were at the top probably for good reason. Sure, they were born lucky, but they worked hard and they made smart choices, and so they ended up being at the top of the system, and it was good for them. They created a fantastic life for themselves, and now even those people have nothing, and I just don't know what to make of it. What he's saying here is, in other words, after the trauma that I went through, I have no idea what's certain anymore. Does this sound like any economy you know, by the way? Part of the pain you see today in society is a lament. It's a way of giving voice to the agony of, I was taught by my parents, I was brought up to believe that if I educated myself and I worked hard and I made smart choices, I'd end up with a good life. And so I did educate myself, I did work hard, I did make good choices, and the company sent my job somewhere else. And now here I am looking for work way less than my skill set and my qualifications. The system that I believed in no longer exists. The world my parents brought me up in, it disappeared some time ago. And it's hard to deal with. Every trauma that you go through puts you in a position of having to deal with a shifting set of circumstances where the old certainties are gone. But do you know what I mean? Okay. There's an old guy on my street. Looks like Santa having a bad day, you know what I mean? He's like an old guy, old beard, old eyes, just old, like old. And sad old. Scared old. I see him quite often, and he shuffles his way nervously to the shop to buy his newspaper and his smokes, and I don't stop and offer him a lift anymore because he doesn't. It scared him, and I get his fear. I get it. His world is gone. Everything he knew is gone. The society he grew up in, his friends, his family, it's all gone. And now he's left with this set of circumstances, and it's all changed, and he's scared. I get it. Then he says, their princes were brighter than snow and whiter than milk, their bodies more ruddy than rubies, their appearance like lapis lazuli, but now they are blacker than soot, not recognized in the streets. So he's talking here about government, and he's saying, there used to be a system. And, we all complained about the system, but the system worked. At least we all knew where we were every day. And the trains kind of ran on time. The mail kind of got delivered most days. The pension system, all of that, it kind of worked. But now that everything's fallen apart, I just don't know where I am. And in your own small way, you know what that's like. Before you went through those things you went through, you had a system. You had a routine. You had plans, you had assumptions about the way life worked, the way life was going to stay, and the way life was going to be. And when all of that got taken away from you, suddenly you woke up in a world where everything was shifting, and you were numb to what was going on, and you didn't know where you were. Moving on. He says, the kings of this earth did not believe, nor did any of the peoples of the world, that enemies and foes could enter the gates of Jerusalem. But it happened. So in chapter 1, I taught you that the historical context of Lamentations is that for centuries, people believed Jerusalem was the city of God, and as the city of God, it was inviolable. Nothing could happen to it. No trauma, no tragedy could ever befall God's sacred city. And what Lamentations is trying to get its head around is that it did happen. 550 BC, the Babylonians come in, and the city, as everyone knew it, ceased to exist. And the pain for this poet is that for most of his life, he's lived with a sense that he was not vulnerable to certain events. That certain tragedies could never happen in his life. And so the last words of that sentence are particularly painful, aren't they? But it happened. Let's just soak up those three words. Against our will. But it happened. I never thought I'd grow old, but it happened. I never thought I'd end up on my own, but it happened. I never thought I'd lose my health, but it happened. I never thought I'd go through those things, but it happened. Now, reading in between the lines of this subtle poem, beginning in verse 1 with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet and ending in verse 22 with the last letter, you kind of see a subtle A to Z of grief. And do you feel in this subtlety that there's something to be said in our lives and in our world? Let's look, for example, at a photograph of the city of Detroit. Within your lifetime, Detroit was the place to be. Within your lifetime, business in Detroit was booming. There were good jobs, good wages, good houses, good place to make a life, to raise a family. But now vast swathes of the once great city look like this. This is a theatre. Big theatre, once the theatre in Detroit. At the weekend, hard-working families would spend their hard-earned wages here in this place, looking at the latest Hollywood movie, relaxing. And now it looks like that. And I quite deliberately showed you a photo of a decayed theatre, knowing that you would be looking at it sitting in a theatre. Take a look around. Everything you see, everything your senses sense, will one day end up like this. In our Western culture, I think we're in the middle of a communal lament. It's a lament that's angry. It's a lament that points fingers. It's a lament that feels cheated, that the gold has lost its luster, that the dollar has lost its value. This, I think, explains the rise of populist movements in North America and Europe. If there were no lament in North America, a person like Donald Trump would never be in with a shout of winning the presidency ever. If there were no lament in Western culture, there would have been no Brexit. If there were no lament, people wouldn't be so angry, so annoyed the way they are. But there is a sense that the system as we knew it is falling apart, that what used to be solid doesn't feel so solid anymore. Every night we feel, as we watch the news, that we're witnessing a world in transition, and there's a necessity to lament it. Everyone said it would never happen, but it happened. Now, loss is change. When you went through that thing you went through, one of the things that made it so difficult was that after it, everything had changed. And so suddenly you had a new routine to get your head around. You had new responsibilities or less responsibilities. You had this new life in a new place with new people or less people. There was just, the trauma put you in a change situation. Loss is change. And that's why loss is often so very difficult. And if it's true to say that loss is change, then I think the reverse is also true. Change is loss. So, remember your last day at high school. 95% of your brain was happy that this was your last day at school. No more homework, no more teachers, yes, last day at school. But 5% of your brain felt slightly melancholic. There was a slight sadness that you couldn't quite understand and you shut it out. That was because you knew that these people in this situation, in this arrangement, it would never happen again, ever. This was the last day. Change is loss. That's why when you look at old photographs of your children, part of your brain enjoys doing that, but part of your brain feels slightly sad. Of course, you're happy that they grew up. You're happy that they don't live in your home anymore. You're happy that they've left. That's because you did. It's natural. That's the way it was. But there's a part of your brain that's sad that they're not kids anymore. That you work in a cubicle for 15 years, some cubicle, and then you get promoted, and you made it to the corner office, and it's great. There's more money, more responsibility, more prestige. It's everything you ever wanted, and for the most part you're happy. But there's a part of you that looks back and says, well, I'm losing something too. I'm missing something too. Loss is change, and change is loss. Life does this to us. And I think it's necessary and healthy to give proper voice to those feelings and give them the lament that they deserve and not shut them out and ignore them. Now, notice at the end of verse 12, the poet says that part of the reason what happened in Jerusalem, part of the reason for the loss was because of the sins of her prophets and the iniquities of her priests, who shed within her the blood of the righteous. So in this sentence, he's talking about the religious professionals who lived and worked at the heart of the religious establishment, the temple of ancient Israel. Now, I think I've taught you before that the temple was, I'm not going to use the word primarily, but it was a central bank. One of the main functions of the ancient Jewish temple was a bank. The priests and the professionals who worked in that temple were somewhat akin to the central bankers and the hedge fund managers of our current financial system. And the wealth that the temple contained in ancient Jewish culture was supposed to be used, among other things, to help the widows and the orphans. But successive generations of priests realized that the less they gave to the widows and orphans, the more they could keep for themselves. This happened too in our culture. People realized that the less quality they gave to customers, the more they could keep for their shareholders. The less wages and benefits they gave to employees, the more money they could keep for the owners. This is the way the world has always turned, I suppose. And so over generations, the temple became corrupt and greedy. This does sound like a culture you know, doesn't it? You perhaps remember this man, Martin Shkreli. In 2015, he was touted as having the most punchable face in America. Not the best accolade you could have. At the time, he was a hedge fund manager. I think he was like, 19 or something, you know. And he bought the rights to a very successful HIV treatment that sold for $13.50. So, fair deal. It extended the lives of people who had HIV, and it was reasonably affordable, and the company made a decent bit of money. The first thing Shkreli did when he bought the company was he raised the price from $13.50 to $750. He reasoned accurately that if someone has HIV, they'll pay anything to stay alive. Now, it's good to make a profit, and I wouldn't want to suggest that there should be a limit on the profits that a person can make, but there does come a point where even Satan says, dude. So what's happening in the years before Lamentations is the priests are ripping off the poor. They're stealing from them, they're raising the prices to enrich themselves, and no one is saying anything. Notice in the sentence he mentions the prophets. One of the roles of prophets in ancient Israel is to stand up in society and say, no, that's not right. Enough is enough. That shouldn't be happening. That needs to change. There's a form of lament that's expressed in grief and despair and depression. And there's another form of lament that's expressed in anger and protest and rage. The kind that stands up and writes a placard, perhaps with a hashtag in front of it, and says, no, 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 this isn't right. This needs to stop. And what verse 12 seems to be saying is that if only someone had the anger, if only someone was mad enough, if only someone was unhinged enough to stand up and say, you need to stop doing what you are doing, then maybe we'd never be in this mess. Maybe we'd never be in this situation. Have you heard of the 29E letter? Anyone heard of this? This is a letter that was written by an angry customer to Continental Airlines. The contents were so funny that they went viral not too long ago. Let me read it to you. It's quite brilliant. Dear Continental Airlines, I am disgusted as I write this note to you about the miserable experience I am having sitting in seat 29E on one of your aircraft. As you may know, this seat is situated directly across from the lavatory, so close that I can reach out my left arm and touch the door. All of my senses are being tortured simultaneously. It's difficult to say what the worst part about seat 29E really is. Is it the stench of sanitation fluid that's blown all over my body every 60 seconds when the door opens? Is it the whoosh of constant flushing? Or is it the passengers' asses that seem to fit into my personal space like a pornographic jigsaw puzzle? I constructed a stink shield by shoving one end of a blanket into the overhead compartment. While effective in blocking at least some of the smell and offering a small bit of privacy, the ass-on-body factor has increased. As without my evil glare, passengers feel free to lean up against what they think is some kind of blanketed wall. I swear the next ass that touches my shoulder will be the last. I'm currently pitching a boardroom full of executives, giving congratulations to the young, promising engineer who figured out how to squeeze an additional row of seats onto the plane by sitting them next to the lavatory. I'd like to flush that engineer's head down the toilet that I'm close enough to touch and taste from my seat. Putting a seat here is a terrible idea. I just heard a man groan in there. This is awful. Does your company give refunds? I'd like to go back to where I came from and start over. My seat could only be worse if it was located inside the bathroom. I would suggest the immediate removal of this seat from all of your aircraft. Just take it away. Leave the smouldering brown hole empty. A good place for sturdy, non-absorbing luggage maybe, but not human cargo. Now, why was that so funny? Why did that letter go viral when it was first released? Maybe because it gives voice to the sorts of things that we're often not angry enough and brave enough to give voice to. Maybe there's 100 things in each of our lives that we should lament. Maybe there's 100 things in each of our lives that we should be angry enough to stand up to and say, no. I can't do this anymore. I can't take any more of that. I can't do that another day. Enough is enough is enough. How much better off would we be today if years ago we stood up and said no? If years ago we were brave enough and mad enough to lament the situation we were in, and in the act of venting our lament, give ourselves space for healing and improvement. This is the power of the lament. This is the power of the anger, of the rage, of the despair. It gives voice to what is wrong. It speaks what is out of order in God's world, and it exposes those conditions. And in exposing them, it sheds light on them and gives space for healing. When we don't lament, when we don't express it either in its grief or despair form or in its anger and rage form, we resign ourselves to powerlessness, give ourselves over to nothing but despair. But lament creates the space you need for healing again. It is so powerful to speak it. Let's fast forward to the last verse of chapter 4, verse 22, which begins with Z, the last letter of the alphabet. Speaking at the end of it, he says, "Your punishment will end, daughter. This will end." When you've accepted life as different, when you face the fact that this new routine that you're in sucks, when you've vented the rage and the anger, when you've stood up and protested the situation that you're in, eventually you come to a place where the pain that you're in gives way to new hope. Do you know why I think Lamentations is written as an acrostic poem from A to Z? I think he's saying subtly that if I can name my grief and my pain, the A to Z of it, the beginning to the end of it, then that's my way of acknowledging that this awful situation can't get any worse. And as soon as you accept that it can't get any worse, you've just given yourself a sliver of hope. And that's all you need sometimes. Just a sliver. Just a little chink of light. That maybe you'll make it out of it. You probably will. And so we should respond to this weird poem by asking ourselves, perhaps, is there a change that we've not properly lamented? Is there a loss that we've not properly grieved? Or is there a thing going on that we've not properly protested? We've not gotten sufficiently mad about? We only live once, and it's so precious. We dare not waste it. Any questions on any of that? Our Father in heaven, we sit in a room full of other people, but the pain in our heads right now is our own. Okay, let's pray then. So we bring to you, in this private moment, our memories and our sorrows, our gratitudes and our hurts, our despairs and our hope. And we ask that in all our thinkings and all our anguishes and all our pains, you will be with us, that you will lead us into the light, that you will give peace to our troubled hearts, guidance to our disoriented souls. We ask this of you through Christ our Lord. Amen.